Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second and final of the 2021 Idea Growth Power Lunch Summit webinars, which we're putting on in partnership with geocomply. Today, we're going to be discussing diversity and iGaming with our panel of experts. Before I introduce the panel and we start, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the session, please just pop them straight into the chat box. And if they're germane to what we're talking about, we'll address them then, or we'll save them until the end. A recording of this webinar will be sent to you as soon as we're finished. And we encourage you to let us know of any topics that you'd like to see covered in future webinars in the follow-up survey that we send. So now I'd like to get started. I'm Amy Knapp, and I act as the Executive Director of the Idea Growth Online Gaming Association. We were formed before PASPA was struck down for companies who were advocating for legalized and regulated online gaming in the United States that extends the kinds of consumer protections that consumers in the United States in other industries expect and are extended by our government. Today, Idea Growth is 30 companies, and we'll look at those just a little bit later. Some of the people on this webinar today are also members of Idea Growth. Lindsay Slater joins us from geocomply, and geocomply is a member. Lindsay, would you like to tell us a few sentences about yourself?
Good day, everyone. My name is Lindsay Slater. I'm the Managing Director of Gaming at geocomply. I'm excited to be a part of this esteemed panel today, as geocomply is very proudly female-led and female-powered organization. And I'm also interested in learning more about diversity, equity, and inclusion from my fellow panelists here.
Thank you, Lindsay. We are also joined by Vanessa Spadafora, who comes to us from our member DraftKings. Vanessa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa Spadafora. I'm the Director of Inclusion, Equity, and Belonging at DraftKings. I've been with the organization for just over 2.5 years now. It's a really exciting time to be with DraftKings, not just because this is the first week of NFL. We have a lot of really great equity work going on that I'm excited to share with you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And finally, we have Agatha Agbanobi, joining us, and I'm very excited to have Agatha talk to us. She is a consultant and works for major US corporations in the area of increasing their diversity, equity, and inclusion. Agatha?
Hi, Amy. It's such a pleasure to be a part of this panel. As you've heard, my name is Agatha. I've been doing equity and inclusion work for quite a bit now, and it's been my pleasure to serve just a wide range of organizations as they try to scale up their hiring and retention efforts as it relates to DEI.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think on our next slide, Ruby, if you could advance that, we just briefly show you all of the esteemed companies that are members of Idea Growth. Idea Growth is a 501c6 trade association, and as I said before, we advocate for legal and regulated online gaming in the United States. Our 30 member companies are strongly united around responsible gaming protections for all US consumers who choose to bet and game online. Our members represent, as you can see from this slide, every sector of this rapidly growing industry in the US. We cover operations, development, technology, payment processing, marketing, and law. And I hope that if any of you are unfamiliar with Idea Growth, that you will visit us online at ideagrowth.org. And that concludes the advertising section of our presentation. So I'd like to start, I think it would be helpful and interesting to get a definition of what is DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm turning to Agatha and Vanessa to lead us through what does that mean?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Amy. So I think, we hear a lot of different acronyms, right? DEI being one of them. We call it inclusion, equity, and belonging at DraftKings. So around our halls, our virtual halls, these days you'll hear us say IEB, but I think it's really important to understand the difference between these. So we'll really quickly kind of go through DEI, which is a very common acronym that you hear in our space. So when you hear the word diversity, very specifically in organizations, that is usually linked to demographics, headcount, the data, right? What are our numbers showing us? I think over the last year and a half in this COVID world, it has definitely proved to expand beyond what we might traditionally think of, protected classes, EEO reporting, things like that, into a broader set of diversity of thought, diversity of experience, right? People who have childcare or elder care responsibilities in this virtual world have definitely felt that differently. So it's ensuring that we have a broad group of people who can bring their unique perspectives and ideas to the table. Now, of course, having those metrics and that measurement in place can start to give you an idea of who is in your population, where are they sitting, what we can be doing better from an innovation standpoint. But it really is just that starting point. It's not the full, sometimes people are looking for that silver bullet. What is that one thing that's going to get this right? And it really is when all of these things work together. So taking that diversity and really looking and analyzing not only, what does our population look like, but how are people moving through career? How are they experiencing the organization? That's where equity comes in. Equity is the systems, the processes, the way in which people are able to navigate their career. Oh, I think we just lost the slide. There we are again. The way in which people are navigating the organization. So if you think of each inflection point of the employee life cycle, from attraction and recruitment all the way through alumni, right? How long are people staying in role? What does our promotion system look like? Is it equitable? That diversity data against the context of how people are experiencing the business is really where you start to see equity. So I think of diversity as who we have in the midst, and equity as how they're experiencing the organization against the context of a level playing field. I'll kick it over to Agatha to talk a little bit about inclusion.
I think that's just such a great segue into inclusion, because inclusion really does center the experience, right? The experience of what it's like to live and breathe in a specific workplace. And I think a lot of times when we talk about inclusion, we've really gotten comfortable in thinking that it's about being welcoming and including folks into a space. When really, when we think about inclusion, it's really about sharing ownership of a space, right? I think there's a popular analogy that's out there about, I think diversity is having a lot of folks at a party, and then inclusion is, inviting everyone in, everyone's welcome at this party. And so when we think about inclusion, we need to be thinking about, who is doing the including, who is the one that's handing out the invitations, who still has the power in this space. And so inclusion is all about getting to a place where everyone is planning that party together, so there are no invitations to be had. And you might still be thinking, well, it's nice to receive invitations to a party, right? It's nice to be invited and to say that this place is a place that I can make my home. It's a place that I can feel okay, in within the workplace. But actually, that's not enough, because a lot of times within workplaces and even parties, there might be some unspoken and spoken rules about, how to interact and how to communicate and all of those things. And usually when there are those rules without our perspective or our input that's already in place, then it doesn't feel like, we're really a part of the space. We feel like we're a guest, where we should actually feel as though it's a place where we really belong. It's a place where we also share that ownership. I hope that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting nuance, Agatha. And I think that sometimes we imagine that the inclusion is handed out by the people who are in management. And this is such a different concept, which is not, I'm privileged to be in the space, or thank you for letting me in the space and add my voice. But in fact, I feel like a full voting member of that space.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because I created that space with you, right? Right. That's the key to inclusion. It's a co-creation of a space to ensure that really all of our voice really matter. We don't have to ask you if our voice matters. We don't need to look at your statement. We built the house together.
And until you brought that up in our rehearsal, I never really thought of that. And I think that it may be a new idea or a new concept. What does co-creation of an organization or a culture look like? I mean, do you have any examples or any thoughts about like what might that look like? What might that mean in practice?
Yeah, Vanessa, I don't know if you want to answer this, but I can quickly give an example. I can even think about, like, let's say, I think first of all, ideally, when you build an organization, that's when you should be thinking about DEI, right? I think, unfortunately, DEI has come way too late for many of us, right? It's almost like we're layering it on instead of having this have been the forefront of how we were designing our org and developing those cultural principles. So now that DEI is as a part of the conversation, right, it means that we have to deconstruct some things that are already in place and then do some reconstructing. So even with the cultural principles, let's say that we've had, for I don't know how many years, I think one example is really to look at each of those principles and say, okay, here, and how we're evaluating our, candidates that come in through our process to be hired. Does this, potentially inadvertently exclude some folks or filter out some folks from diverse perspectives of what it means to be a leader? Because I can tell you that a Western definition of leadership may not necessarily be the same definition of leadership outside of the West, right? So in African countries and Indian countries, especially among women populations, leadership looks different. And so just a quick example of that really is, taking a leadership principle, deconstructing the definition of that, and making sure that that principle and how we look for it encompasses potentially a diversity of thought or a diversity of perspective in how we lead.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think, to your point earlier, Agatha, this idea of inclusion is really around reconstructing something. And if you think of kind of these terms going backwards as well, those of us who are kind of strategy nerds always go up one side of the ladder and down the other. They really do work together, and it doesn't have to be these broad brushstrokes. If you think of any of the system's processes, benefits, perks that you might be rethinking as an organization right now, that is a great space to kind of start working with some of these concepts. An example of that recently at DraftKings is that we were exploring new benefits providers, right? Our healthcare, we had grown to a point where it was time to kind of start reconstructing what that looked like. And we knew we wanted to do a better job than, the gaps that are left by the US healthcare system in a lot of spaces for a lot of people. And it would have been very easy for us to check a few boxes and just run towards the goalpost of open enrollment. And rather than doing that, we took a step back and we said, who is building this, right? If we're talking about our healthcare benefits, can we bring people to this table and build something with an inclusive landscape? And with that approach taken, we were able to provide best-in-class benefits for gender affirmation and transgender procedures that cover things far beyond the traditional scope. And those are areas that not only as a business are we doing better, but our employees' lives are actually impacted on a day-to-day basis, not just within our virtual walls, but also as they walk through the world, the employee experience becomes the human experience. So that's an example of something that you can start thinking about if you're rethinking some of the benefits, some of the processes or systems that your employees interact with. Who is making that decision? Who is part of that conversation? And is that even the right population, or is that the most expedient?
Great.
And sorry, go ahead, Amy.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the last thing I'll add to that is that just it's a good reminder of this another term that's really good called paternalism, where we often make decisions about folks who are going to be affected by those decisions without consulting them first. And when we don't take that into account, that could be a huge hindrance in building an inclusive workspace and also building trust, right? I really, really love the idea and the examples you provided, Vanessa, because we're talking about going to the folks that actually are going to be affected by our decisions before we say, hey, here's what's coming down the pipeline, like we like to say.
Right, great. Thank you. Thank you guys very much. Okay, so we sort of set the landscape here, and I'd like to move on to the next slide, Ruby. And we're going to go through some questions and have some conversation. And, we're business people, right? So the first question that we need to talk about is value. And we need to look at what value does diversity and inclusion bring to an organization from a lot of different perspectives, right? And Lindsay, we haven't heard from you yet. So if you would like to jump in first on this conversation, I'd like to look at value from different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious answer for me, and while I'm not an expert in the area of diversity, inclusion, and equity in the same sense that Agatha or Vanessa are, I mean, just having a better representation of the society that we actually live in is obviously one of the values that I would think that an organization would be seeking to represent, where everyone is included. Skill and talent can often be hard to find amongst those who aren't ideally equitably positioned or in an inclusive environment. So trying to find strategies and essentially look for a framework internally in your organization to try to drive change and recognize what kind of values you want to speak to calls for a lot of house building and groundwork, as everyone has mentioned here. But I think the value of bringing the spirit of these values to the organization would also be to celebrate people's differences, to create a more multicultural landscape that makes work more interesting and people more interesting just in general.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think you started out by saying that we want our organization to mirror the people that we serve, the community in which we work. And as someone who's coming at it from a marketing perspective, that feels to me like it makes us more successful because we connect better with our customers, and that's what they want, right? In this world of individualized service and connection with brands, right? It helps us. Do you guys feel like it really helps an organization be more aligned with the people who are buying from it?
Yeah, and I mean, that isn't necessarily always the most convenient approach for everybody either, right? I mean, which I guess is the whole point. It takes extra effort to be able to, affirm these efforts and values, whether you're doing marketing or something internal.
I would say that I think that also goes back to Agatha's earlier point around paternalism, right? You can only reach different audiences beyond your current market share if you're being authentic there, right? You don't want to pander to audiences or try to apply what you think that they want based on, you know, your perspective that might have nothing to do with the audience you're trying to reach, especially those in marginalized communities. We have been kind of trained throughout life to start clocking that inauthenticity really early on. So it's just not going to work. Of course, you know, all of what Lindsay had shared is spot on. This is the right thing to do. I don't think any of us would be on this call if we didn't believe that. But to Amy's point, there is a real business imperative here, but you can only unlock that business value if you're going about it authentically and really taking that time to be sure that people are at the table with diverse perspectives in order to be able to inform some of those approaches.
Yeah, and thinking about being authentic, I mean, I think if you try to go halfway or pick and choose on a few little things, it can almost be perceived as tokenism, right? Where you're like, well, I'll just drop this diverse catch line in my footer and call it a day. Probably going to not really portray the image that you were hoping for, like the intention that you were really hoping for. Probably isn't the most authentic intention.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add to that is just to be wary of generalizations when we're talking about different groups from communities of color. You know, I think that, and I was just sharing this with the recent client I was coaching today, is that I think because for communities of color, a lot of our lived experience is similar because there's so much big stuff that we're still trying to fight. Right, as opposed to non-communities of color, that it's easy to begin to generalize and say all folks from this region or this area want your product to look just like this. And it's also potentially even easier, right? It might cost less money as opposed to being a bit more nuanced and differentiated in our approach when we're doing this work.
Right, and how could you really be nuanced and differentiated if you're not an insider in that community, if you don't have representation in the corporate entity for all of those things?
Absolutely. And then the last thing I'll say is the thing that we don't hear enough about is folks from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So it's, you know, and different education backgrounds. You know, you're gonna see a different Agatha if I didn't have the same education background or upbringing that I did. You know, I potentially communicate slightly differently, potentially might be a bit more settled in certain environments than others. So it's very, very important that we avoid generalization when we're having these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is in customer communications and marketing in general. That's our huge challenge right now because everybody wants to feel that things are personalized to them. So this is one step that an organization can take to get closer to that, right? By including all of those perspectives. So this next question, I think we're ready to move on unless anybody had anything else to ask. But my next question is, it feels sometimes, I think, to some people that DEI belongs to the HR group, and we'll just keep it over there, and it'll be okay, right? And that's sort of a lot of responsibility for the HR group, right? And obviously, I'm thinking that it needs to be a company-wide effort. So how do we make that happen? How do we move it out of HR and spread it across the entire organization?
Yeah, I think there are a few things here, and this is very deeply connected into what we were just talking about. It can be really scary, nerve-wracking. I know there's a lot on the line sometimes with certain decisions that are being made as far as dollars and time and things like that, to verge away from the things that we've known to work, right? That case precedence. This has worked, you know, in the past last year, this ad spot worked, or last year, this customer outreach worked, or whatever it was. So we're going to stick with that. And when you bring diversity of thought to the table and empower those voices to share difference in opinion, it can feel really scary to go down a path that you hadn't necessarily gone down before, right? So part of it is trusting the voices that you've started building with. To go back to that inclusion definition, start building something new with those voices and be willing to take that risk, because it will pay off. And just because you haven't necessarily seen it or thought of it that way before doesn't mean that it is not going to work. It just means that maybe you hadn't seen it before, right? So I think that's one thing. It's in those everyday decisions that we're making about our business, not just the HR decisions around our benefits and policies and promotions, right? I think the other piece of that is really understanding that the manager has more interaction with their team than anybody in HR, no matter where you sit in HR, right? So it's those everyday behaviors of noticing, bringing some awareness to the micro things that are happening. Some people might refer to them as microaggressions. There are positive things on the flip side of that coin as well. But the micro behaviors that maybe, you know, we're constantly overlooking the one person who stays quiet in the room. What can you do to draw their voice out? The HRBP is not going to be able to do that in brainstorming sessions, right? So it really is on the onus of team leaders and the whole team to start recognizing the team dynamic and implement some structure or some processes to those team dynamics to ensure that we are getting the richness of perspectives and ideas out of each team member in a way that we're not going to be able to do with broad brushstrokes across recruiting, benefits, operations, things like that.
And Vanessa, when you mention drawing out those voices that maybe aren't heard, I mean, I realize the question is, what can you do beyond recruiting in HR? But I feel like a recent example with geocomply that we felt like in order to complement HR and recruiting, we had to become a little bit more novel and think beyond just collecting resumes and whatnot, standard recruiting strategy, and try to understand, like, how can we get into the community where organizations that serve the diverse populations that we were hoping to reach, that we really didn't know how to, what you know, how can we unlock talent that would otherwise be hidden from us? So an example was we partnered with a community organization, YWCA, who helps new immigrants to Canada, I'm in Vancouver, Canada, find work, and encourage them to apply for tech jobs, because, you know, wherever they were being pushed just by means of convenience or standard in the types of roles that maybe a newcomer to the country would apply for, no one was applying for the tech jobs, even if they were jobs that, you know, match their skill set perfectly, or maybe the, you know, the job description was very exclusionary and you know, to this potential candidate pool. And we had a lot of success finding people that never would have found us.
Oh, that's very interesting.
And the thing I would add here too is, much to what Vanessa was saying earlier, with that sort of like, you know, defining a perspective about why this shouldn't live in HR, is that, you know, it should live in every aspect of everyone's job within the company / organization, right? It should be a shared responsibility. And I think that sometimes when we start up these, you know, DEI departments and there's a head of DEI, and we begin to silo this work as opposed to make this work integral to everyone's functionalities. And then I think the other thing about this conversation too is that we can't just say it and expect people to do it, right? So there's got to be some real accountability in place, right? We've got accountabilities in place for almost everything else, right, with performance management. And so thinking about ways that we can tie it to just, you know, performance metrics and our evaluation cycle within the company to ensure folks are actually really doing what they say they're aspiring to do and what we are holding them to do within this work.
So that's interesting, Agatha. What would an accountability look like? I can't even quite picture that.
That's so good. I think let's even just talk about hiring, right? So there are a lot of recruiters. I mean, a lot of the work that I do is working with recruiters because unfortunately that's where a lot of the attention is, as opposed to maybe retention and building a much more inclusive workplace culture that would attract, you know, the diverse candidates or underrepresented candidates that we're seeking. But I would say, yeah, like one key thing is not focusing so much on how many we bring into the recruitment cycle, but more so how many do we actually hire, and then how many of them are actually staying. Like those are real metrics to say, okay, it's not just, we're not just doing the work and inviting and getting people in the door, but we're also doing the work to getting them to stay. So those are some real tangible metrics that you can do to tie to folks' role. Now I realized that those was examples from HR and recruiting, so I should have probably given you another example for program management or something else. But yeah,
well,
I think,
you know, the proof is in the pudding. If they stay, then you did it right. And if they're all leaving after a year, then there's something broken internally.
Yeah, I think it depends on what the role is. I think even like with, I don't know, maybe finance. I've never worked in finance, but maybe in finance, one thing that I've talked at length about too, just with the education programs that folks tend to get really comfortable in DEI. So we'll get all aware and be educated, but it's hard to actually put what we know to practice. I think one really key thing too is communication interaction. I think that's like a evaluation metric across all roles. And so if there are ways that we're evaluating all employees on this, whether it's through 360 feedback or whatnot within teams, that's one real metric to say, okay, well, you know, everyone is saying that when they're in a meeting with you, they feel as though their voice is heard. When they're in a meeting with you, they feel as though you're and so forth. So I think there are real tangible ways to begin to say, here are the metrics that show, or the data that shows that I am really exhibiting or living out these principles as it relates to interaction and comms.
Right.
I love that, Agatha, and I think that feeds into your earlier point about that accountability mechanism at year end for everybody, right? Every year end process looks different, but there's always space in there to create room for people to get a little bit more credit for the things that they're not necessarily getting credit for, right? What else are you doing to act as a culture carrier for our organization? How can we ensure that you're being seen and rewarded for that work that really is additional work? But if you think about it holistically, right, going back to that, like what is the whole employee life cycle, even of just annual review, we know that the work that's getting done is what we set out to do at the start of the year and what we're measuring throughout. So is there also room in our goal setting to ensure that there's space for people to plan a focus area or one thing that they're going to do? Maybe it is contributing to recruiting efforts and being on campus or speaking or things like that. Maybe they're contributing to other parts of the organization, like the social corporate responsibility or the inclusion efforts on resource groups or responsible gaming or whatever it might be that that individual employee wants, right? Again, not putting that on the employee, but giving them space to explore parts of culture carrying in an organization, really attaching their passion to the work that they're doing and then getting credit for it at the end of the year, and it not just being this expected, well, if you're interested in issues that women face in the workplace, we would expect you to lead the women's BRG. Really making sure that it's a little bit more explicit and helping people along the way with those systems and processes in order to create that equity.
And maybe if I could add, like also creating a safe space for people to voice their feedback and opinions when, you know, if you're not ready to wave a banner, to be the leader or to advocate out loud, you know, maybe it's having anonymous feedback in a specific forum, creating different ways to have those conversations where everyone, you know, has the options to voice their opinion the way that they need us to meet them at.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Okay. So we know that we're supposed to be making everyone feel included. So that goes without saying with the next question. And what I'd really love to hear about are some examples or ideas. What can be done, right, to make sure that everybody feels included?
That's really good. And I'll just kick it off. And then, after that, Vanessa or Lindsay, you can feel free to chime in. We've already talked about expanding the space or building the space together. So, folks feel as though their voice is really valued, and it's not just being invited, it's expected that it's going to be heard, right? Because we built that space together. And so I think about just a quick principle such as like making rounds, right? So where everyone is expected to contribute in some way. And even with that, we can even get a little bit more granular and say, not everyone has to, speak up in the meeting, because not everyone feels comfortable speaking up in a meeting or every single meeting, right? And so how do we diversify the ways that we contribute to a conversation, right? And this goes into the accessibility piece of, not everyone internalizes information best when it's written. Worship of the written word that we tend to have in Western cultures. Sometimes it's better when it's oral, when it's in person, or when it's in, written email communication, or, there's quite a few options out there. The other thing I think about too is the pressure to be articulate and polished all the time with our speech. Sometimes that actually hinders folks from contributing, especially folks of color, because there is this double pressure. It's combating the stereotype that we might not be articulate, first of all. And then there's this double pressure of feeling as though we have to overperform all the time. So oftentimes when we're in meetings like this, or in spaces where we're sharing space, sharing a multicultural space, I should say, we often might feel the pressure that our idea has to have gone through, 10 levels of evaluation in our head before it ever comes out, even though we're just in a brainstorming session, right? And so sort of beginning to like even not just, say, we kind of expect it from you, but putting into practice where, white individuals and folks of color are actually practicing the idea of not always sounding as though we're being recorded in meetings, opening up the space for different types of communication styles. And then lastly, I think the other bit is, when folks, are volunteering ideas in a space where we're, communicating and all of that, making sure that we're always asking questions as opposed to jumping in and trying to rephrase it in a much better way, and even potentially take credit for someone else's idea because it didn't necessarily sound polished or articulate in the way that would have been more soothing to our ears. I think those are some real concrete ways to begin to open up a space where it really feels like it's a shared ownership.
I love that concept of taking a step back and asking questions. We tend to get right into our perspective on things when it comes from, a contribution of somebody else. And we tend to, always want to defend our contributions and things like that. And that's really not going to get us to the place where we want to get, especially when it comes to inclusion, innovation, all of those things. I often hear people ask, okay, but like, how, right? Like, what are the questions I should be asking? What is the script? Things like that. And I'll share, a sometimes unpopular opinion here. You have to start at home, right? We oftentimes, especially over the course of the last year and a half, have been talking about having difficult conversation, understanding the experience of others, but that keeps the conversation and the experience over there in a lot of ways. Until you start unpacking your own stuff, your experience, your privilege, your position, all of those things, it becomes really, really difficult to start asking questions in a meaningful way, and not just asking questions for the sake of asking questions because you're supposed to, right? Start asking yourself some questions. And they can start pretty easy and then build on there, but how did I get here, right? What are some of the things that I worry about what are some of the ways that I might be showing up and taking space? There are a lot of analytical people on this call, I'm sure. Start clocking it. How much space have I taken up in any given meeting today, right? If it's more than 25% on a 10-person call, you have some work to do, right? Maybe it's sitting on your hands a little bit more, or asking, how did you come to that a little bit more? And just starting there will get you to that place where you're asking really in-depth dynamic questions that have meaning and are productive to the contribution. But until we start to see ourselves as members of a holistic community, as participants in the landscape, the equity, the inequity that we're all experiencing at the organization, we won't be able to get to that place, because we need to have that self-awareness in order to bring it forward in everything we do. There is no just flip the light switch and I'm going to ask the right question. I'm sure a lot of people would love that, like, what do I back end code in my brain just to make it easy and happen? But until you really start asking yourself those difficult questions, it's incredibly challenging to make it feel like an authentic question that you're asking someone, and not just kind of drilling for an end game.
Yeah, that's good.
So to commit the sin of rephrasing, I think that you're saying that there isn't space for everybody to be included when there are people who are really first and who are taking up more space. And so recognizing, if you're one of those people who's taking up the conversational or decision-making space, it's unlikely that other people can feel included.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Lindsay, did you have anything you wanted to add in that?
I'm just thinking about examples of how everyone can feel included. I know there's some different ways that you can offer, training inside your organization. Geocomply did something really interesting just this year as a group kind of training activity amongst everyone, not just a particular department, where we wanted to give everyone better opportunity for shared language and understanding, and something as simple as how to write a job description. So, I mean, we got all the people together that would never in a million years be thinking about job descriptions, and take job descriptions we had actually, job postings we had up online, and to rewrite them together as groups, and to try to understand like what kind of inequities were we maybe, all the unwritten language that was being unloaded into these job postings. Maybe it was about gender, maybe it was about putting in a bullet list of 20 different qualifications, and recognizing that there's certain groups that may never apply because that list is scary, rather than limiting it and leaving it more open to possibility of certain people applying, and everyone asking themselves out loud, someone from finance or someone from a dev team of ours, if you wanted to make sure that you had every audience possible applying and finding the true talent that you want, how would you literally edit the language in this group Google Doc together? And it was pretty enlightening, everyone's thought process, and I would say, it was really great compared to just leaving it up to HR to try to take care of that for us. We all have a pretty good shared understanding of what needs to happen, regardless of whether or not we're the ones that actually are writing a job description day to day.
Oh. That sounds like a really interesting exercise. Looking in the mirror. So we hear about DEI being a continuous process, and I was the one that came up with this question because I didn't really know the answer. I think that we've talked about this to some degree. What does it look like in practice? And I think that you've talked about this in your answers to other questions, but if you have other things to add.
I mean, I can go ahead, Lindsay, you go ahead and start.
At Geocomply, I think we have tried to do our best and everything that we've talked about today without any kind of an official framework or guiding policies internally, to keep that spirit alive as we grow, which has been really challenging. The vision of a few cannot be the vision of many as you grow, unless you really put in the effort, which may be literal, written framework, policies, strategies to keep that spirit alive, which starts with leadership. So we've looked at a framework called Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmark as, I guess, best practice, kind of a toolkit to start and understand how we can apply that to our organization and keep this spirit alive.
And I'm sorry for interrupting you there, Lindsay, but I got excited about this question because it's not just about continuous process, but continuous improvement process. It's like, I think oftentimes when we feel like we've gotten it, or we've gotten into a groove in this work, we tend to become a bit more transactional than transformational. And so we're doing all the things, but we're not maybe slowing down systematically or systemically, I'm not sure which one, but on a routine basis, to make sure that what we're doing is actually producing the impact that we want to achieve, right? So how do we balance our transactional practices with our transformational practice, or our transformational lens, is really, really important. I always talk about data because it's so important. I think what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. I think that's a famous quote. And so we just can't risk not measuring impact in this work. We can't just be procedural. We have to be impactful and measure that continuously.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think, I'm also a big, proponent of analyzing the data. What's next? Where should we be looking? The data is not really telling you the whole story. It's telling you where to start looking, right? So you can always get more granular. You can always get more specific, whether it's by, job, family, and type. If it's finance has, one area of focus versus analytics versus, marketing, things like that, by geography, et cetera. Then there are the broad brushstrokes across an organization that, going back up usually does fall somewhere in the HR realm. But I think the important piece here around this continuous progress is two things. It's one, recognizing that there really is no end game, right? There's no silver bullet, like I said before. There's not that like one metric that needs to be hit and maintained or anything like that. The second piece is that this is people stuff, right? In a lot of ways, and people evolve. So the work will always evolve. And I think the last year and a half has really taught us that. A lot of us had to completely shift the way in which we were approaching our work, and your diversity team or your equity team, your inclusion team was no different, right? A lot of what we had to do had to shift to not only this new way of doing work, but the way in which people were experiencing the work. So the conversation around parenting really took center stage this past year in a way that it hadn't before. LGBTQ issues, right? That acronym can go on for quite some time, and it's really recognizing why that acronym changes as frequently as it does and as dynamically as it does, and who's still being left off of that, right? It's constantly kind of looking at the other side of every coin to see what else is missing and where we can be doing a better job. When it comes to interacting and engaging with people, there really is no singular approach. It's very nuanced. So continuing to dig deeper, ask questions, and reflect on your own experience as well is an ever-changing process. So you just kind of have to keep rolling with it, keep looking out for those clues in the data for where to look, and keep having conversations with people. It can't just be these assumptions or the white papers or the HBR articles. Those are really helpful to get you started, but it really is in that human interaction that keeps it going and changing and evolving over time.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I think that this wraps us up, and we're going to move on to some questions. Some people sent in questions. And so I'm going to read one of them. I am interested in hearing the panel address increasing Indigenous representation in the area of DEI. Thank you very much for asking that. And would one of our panelists like to jump in?
Yeah, I can speak to that. And you know, I feel like this is a topic where I personally needed to grow my understanding of really how you do this. And I talked to a colleague of mine outside of our industry. Shout out to Samantha Arrow. She is an Indigenous diversity trainer for the Public Health Authority here where I live in Vancouver. And her thoughts on this that she'd shared with me was that there are some ideas that she had. So one being offering some anti-racism training within your organization. This helps give everyone some shared language and understanding of the topic at hand. And I think I mentioned that earlier, really any kind of opportunities that you can create inside your organization for training, for group discussions where you can grasp a shared language and understanding is going to be beneficial. And I recognize the challenge of that is probably going to be dealing with, you know, if you have different offices and different locations, that shared language understanding might be different depending on who we're actually talking about inside our organization. Increasing diversity in your staff, but also in the committees, councils, groups, departments within it. Also naming and acknowledging, you know, either the company or individuals inside your organization as a settler of, you know, in North America of this land, and maybe it means having land acknowledgement. Here in Vancouver, it's quite common, particularly for government organizations at least, to, you know, reference, you know, we're on the unceded lands of the XYZ nation. That's something that you can consider. Also, you know, I'd mentioned it before, opening opportunities for feedback, but also creating forums for anonymous feedback to create those safe spaces and different options for people to voice their opinions. And of course, doing, you know, just doing maybe just one of these things, like adding a catchphrase in your footer, is gonna potentially make you come off as inauthentic. So I think what's important is keeping it as holistic as possible in different areas of really how you run your organization. Making representation inside your company meaningful, because bringing Indigenous people on board into roles isn't enough if it isn't a culturally safe space for them to even be there.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Lindsay. I really appreciate it. Let me see if we have any other questions. Okay. If a company is just starting out with diversity and inclusion policies, where should they begin?
Yeah, so I can jump in here. If we're talking specifically about policies, I think the first step is exactly what we were talking about around the inclusion piece. Who are these policies intended to serve? And who are they predominantly serving? Oftentimes, those are two different answers, whether we intended for them to be or not. So really understanding, you know, if we're talking about, I'll just use an example of family planning policies, right? If we're talking about our family planning and we're checking a box that we have family planning benefits and leave policies, but those benefits are, you know, kind of hindering on some things around formal diagnoses of infertility, right? And our leave policy is really hindered on gender or primary versus secondary caregivers, things like that. The intention is for everybody to have these benefits, but who you're actually serving are predominant majority employees, right? The straight, cisgendered, heterosexual employees among you, because those tiny clauses that seem very, just kind of standard, everyday part of the way in which these benefits work, they really are not so small, especially when you think of single parents, the next generation of talent who are coming into the workplace asking themselves questions like, do I need to choose between having a family and having a career, because the economy that we've inherited is not the same as it was for my parents? Are we ensuring that LGBTQ families are being recognized in the same way? So I think the first step is looking at the policy and saying, who is this intended to serve and who is it actually serving? And once you start to think about the people who are not being served by those policies, getting those individuals involved, right? And it's not tasking them with educating you. The first step could be Google, right? I mean, anytime we have a question on anything else, we tend to Google it. That is not the single source of truth. There is not a truth well in Google, certainly, but it'll give you some foundational questions to start asking employees so that you're not burdening them with, tell us what we should be doing from benefits. And then they're just kind of like, well, I don't really know where to go with that because I'm not an HR professional and this isn't my wheelhouse. But really giving some concrete, here's what we're thinking about. How does that or does that not serve you? And then aggregating that data and kind of going from there. But I think the first step is really assessing that landscape.
Thank you very much. So we've got 3 minutes left. Should we go on to another question, Ruby? Or, okay, we will do it. So how do international businesses with different locations tackle the concept of DEI? There's a big question, and you have 2.5 minutes to answer it.
I mean, I guess I'll take this one. I think it's context matters so much. And I think even just growing up in the States, we tend to think sometimes that our way of doing things is the way the rest of the world should be doing it. Like we've invented the script. And so I think in the same way that we do a landscape analysis within orgs, I would encourage businesses, international businesses, to do landscape analysis that includes just geographical indicators, right? To better understand really what are some of those forefront issues, let's say in the UK or in London, compared to in Ireland and so forth. The data will show that your focus areas just will have to be varied. And also it will also let you key in on the fact that your strategy should also be varied, right? So I think, again, just sort of encouraging folks not to get so comfortable in the awareness and education lane and really begin to think about how do we dive into strategy work alongside the training and the awareness piece and the analysis work to ensure that, you know, we're pulling multiple levers out at the same time. And it's not necessarily, you know, it has to be and then continuing to remain very open-minded to what will potentially show up.
Thank you. We are now at 1 minute 2, so I'm going to just throw in some closing remarks, but thank you very much, Agatha. So thank you to everybody for attending today's session discussing diversity and iGaming. I want to thank our expert speakers, Lindsay, Vanessa, and Agatha, for weighing in on your perspectives in this panel discussion. I'd also like to thank Idea Growth and geocomply for presenting this webinar. The recording of this webinar session will be sent to you in the next few days, so please look out for that and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.